Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks very much. And thank you for very kind words about Coda. Very nice to hear. When we first came up with the idea for Coda, which is a nonprofit newsroom that covers global crisis thematically. We also thought it was such a great idea that surely someone would come along with $1 million or $2 million and we'd be set, right? Well, guess what? That didn't happen. But what did happen for myself and many other people in my organization is a 4-year-old, an incredible 4-year-long learning curve throughout which we learned more about what it takes to keep a media organization sustainable than personally I ever bargained for. So from crowdfunding campaigns to institutional donors and risks of getting too dependent on them, to reader-generated revenue. Sustainability is today one of the biggest issues facing journalism, and it's something that keeps so many of us awake at night, and COVID-19 has definitely not made it any easier. It has amplified journalism's desperate need for sustainability. So this is what this segment will be about. We have 3 sessions today, 4 incredible speakers, and I am so delighted to be starting today with a person who in my mind is really one of the most creative, most brilliant minds in our media industry. We'll run out of time if I start going through Jennifer Brandel's achievements. They are in the bio on the website, so check it out. But, apart from being an award-winning journalist, Jennifer has done something that for the industry that is both very obvious and somehow has escaped us for decades. And that is she has forced us to start listening to our audiences. Jennifer is a founder of Hearken, which means to listen. And Hearken is behind a now proven process that helps newsrooms create better stories and become more sustainable by listening to their audiences. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I'm so pleased to be here today. The only thing that could make it better is if we were in Prague. Never been, it's still on my list. So hopefully in 2021. I'm really excited to share with you our process and what we've learned over the last really 8 years of doing this different approach to journalism. And so before I get started into the journalism part of it, I want to just pull back and think for a moment outside of journalism. So all of us, every country, every town, every group of people has a set of complex problems to answer right now, especially with COVID. And so I want you to take a moment to think about who holds the answers to these complex problems. Is it the people who work for the institutions who are in charge of solving those problems? Is it the people who are directly affected by those problems and have lived experience? Or is it a combination of both, plus probably some outside perspectives? Now, hopefully, when you're looking at this, you're thinking of the third choice. It's got to be some combination. The people who work for institutions often don't face those problems themselves, so they might not have as great of ideas as to how to solve them. The people directly affected don't have the power necessarily or understand the process of how these things get fixed. And so they need to work together, right, in order to answer complex problems. Now, I would argue that setting a newsroom's agenda is a complex problem. You are trying to help shape the narrative and the possibilities within a certain place. And so the same question, who should be in charge of setting a newsroom's agenda? Is it the people who work at the newsroom, the people the newsroom is supposed to be serving, or some combination of both, plus some outside perspectives? Now, hopefully this is obvious. I think the answer is the third. Again, some combination of those two groups of people, the people who are making the decisions and the people who those decisions affect, plus, getting inspiration from outside as well. And so I want you to think about who sets your newsroom's agenda. Is it just the people inside of your news organization? Or do you have a process by which the public can be part of it in some way, shape, or form? If the public is not involved, I argue that is a problem, and I'll tell you why. So this is an oversimplification, of course, but if you think about the traditional reporting approach, it really positions the newsroom at a higher level than the public. And it's saying, from the top of the hill, here's what we think you need to know. It's really the newsroom acting as a parent to the public rather than a partner. And they're telling the public, which is kind of an abstract mass of people, whether that's looked at by data, demographics, money that they're bringing in. The audience is kind of just this concept. They're not actually real people. And this approach leaves a lot of innovation on the table. So instead, what we've been trying for the last 8 years and has been working beautifully is what we call a public-powered approach. And instead of the newsroom assuming they know what the public needs to know, because again, they don't share the lived experience of everyone they're trying to serve, they create an opening for the public to have a say. And so instead of saying, here's what we think you need to know, it flips it into a question. What do you not know that we can find out with and for you? And it treats the public as individuals, looks at them as, complex, dynamic people, not just a big caricature or a mass, and gets to work with them individually in order to tell better stories that are more relevant to people outside of the newsroom. And this also positions the newsroom as a servant rather than a parent. And I don't know about you, I would never want to be responsible for parenting the audience I'm trying to serve. That's too much responsibility. So this is a way of serving the public and knowing before you report that what you're doing is relevant. And so I want to explain how this relates to how stories typically get made. So again, an oversimplification here, but usually stories happen in 4 to 5 different decision-making stages. So there's the pitch phase where the ideas get generated, then a decision gets made and it's assigned, then you report, then you publish or broadcast, and that's the first time typically where the public is able to be involved, comments, reactions, sharing. And I don't know about you, but when I was a reporter, right after a story was finished, I was moving on to the next one. I was not there to listen. I was not there to be shaped by the public's response to it necessarily. I didn't have time. And so as you can see here, there's this 2 ships passing in the night. The newsroom and the public don't have a chance to actually learn from one another and shape each other. And so here's what the public-powered story cycle looks like instead. The public can be involved at every step of the way. So they can ask their questions. They can vote on the best questions that the newsroom curates. So it's not, again, a free-for-all. The newsroom can say, these are really good questions we think we could answer. Let's let the public decide which we should focus our resources on. And then my favorite part as a reporter was actually having the person whose question we were answering be part of the story process. So that could mean coming along for an interview, being part of the story, being featured, being a character, a protagonist even in the story. And then the cycle can continue because after a story is complete, you can say, what additional questions do you have about this topic? And you can let the public lead you to what they need to know to do their jobs as citizens. And so I want to take a moment to let you know, a lot of newsrooms do this pitch, pipeline where they say, send us your story ideas, or they have a tip, a place to have news tips. Those are both great, but they attract people who are already certain about something. So if you're collecting questions instead, you're attracting people who are humble enough to say, hey, I don't know something, can you help? So that's a different kind of personality or a different kind of energy they're bringing to the story. And it starts from a more neutral position than, hey, you should do a story about X thing. And why? Oftentimes people have another agenda. Questions are also really incredible about helping to untangle people from their preconceived notions and open them up to new ideas. A question is an invitation to broaden your horizons versus make you more trenchant in your viewpoint. And I think in the US, at least where I'm based, that is so needed right now. People are so dug into their side, and questions help kind of create that middle space. And then reporting on questions and answers means you don't have to report from a place of conflict. You can report from a place of adventure. And the bad guy in the story doesn't have to be a person. It can just be the difficulty of finding information. And so this can be friendlier, especially to people that have news fatigue and feel like opening up the paper or reading stuff is just an invitation to be sad. This is a way of creating some inspiration and some learning. And then of course, questions are the atomic unit of journalism. Every story starts with a question. And so people don't have to have these understandings of how news pitches work and the way that the process works. They can just enter in by asking a question. So I want to share with you what can happen when the public is able to ask questions, because sometimes people think, oh, they're going to ask bad questions, or the questions aren't going to be important or lead to interesting stories. Opposite is true. The public has incredible questions that lead to stories newsrooms wouldn't have seen and that are very important and that change the shape of where they live. And so one example here, I'm based in Chicago, and a newsroom that I actually started at WBEZ collects questions in this series called Curious City. And a woman had written in, Christina Gomez, to ask about public water fountains. They were on all day and all night. And she just said, this is strange. Why are we wasting water? Can you look into it? And enough people, more people were asking the newsroom that they said, you know what, this is strange. Let's look into it. Well, it turns out that the water was so contaminated with lead that they wanted to flush the public water fountains so that people wouldn't get sick from it. And they weren't telling anybody about it. This became an ongoing story, a national story. It influenced our mayoral elections. It's been a huge, huge piece. And this is all because people were asking questions. It broke news. The public can also correct the record. I love it when these stories happen. This is an example from some partners in the Netherlands. In The Hague, there was a street sign that was named after Nobel Prize laureate Madame Curie, and it was misspelled in a very unfortunate way, where instead of Madame Curie, it was more of a prostitute Curie, a different spelling for it. And the woman on the right here, you can see with the blonde hair, Els, is the question asker, and she had gone through all of the traditional routes. She had, called up her local officials. She had tried to organize to get this sign to be changed because it was very bothersome for good reason, and nothing happened. But she contacted a news organization who was taking the questions, asked the question, they did a story on it, and the sign was changed in 2 days. So she was able to correct the record very quickly without having to protest or, do all these other things that take a long time for citizens to make change. Now, the last example I'll give you is just spurring systems change entirely. So in San Francisco, they have a very complex way of deciding where children go to school. And it's very confusing and very anxiety inducing for parents. And so someone asked our partners in California in the Bay about how does this system actually work? There was no easy answer online. And by doing the story about how the system worked and what its flaws were, people were able to organize and say, this is ridiculous. We should be doing things differently. And because of that story, the lottery system has changed. It gave citizens the understanding of how power flowed and also where they could intervene. And it allowed people to see a process that needed updating. So these are all things that happen just by a person asking a question and a newsroom listening. And one other example I want to give you is our partners in Denmark at TV2 Funen have been looking at this through the lens of trust. How do we not just create great stories, but how do we deepen the relationship with the people we serve? And they turned all of their coverage around coronavirus over to the public asking questions. And they did this really quickly in March and April when things started to get bad. And they've been studying the outcomes of this and asking the public, how do you feel about these different types of stories that are coming from you and not from us? And as you'll see in the results, I won't read them all off, but people overwhelmingly believe it makes their coverage more relevant. They feel closer to the newsroom. They think it's improved the role in the community. They'll probably engage again, and they don't really worry that this is taking away from other coverage. They love it. They love it. And what does that love turn into? It turns into money, and it turns into loyalty. And so I won't read through all of these different statistics, but if your newsroom uses a funnel approach where you're thinking about, how do you get a large group of people to get closer and closer to you in order to pay, subscribe, become a member, etc., this is a proven way of doing it. We see that these stories outperform typical newsroom stories many times over, up to 15 times. They have a higher time on page. They're coming from people's actual desires and questions, and so people get very curious about it. People also are so much more likely to opt into a newsletter, which we know is on the path to giving. And then we also saw that people are more than 2 to 5 times as likely to start to subscribe to that newsroom if they see that that newsroom is serving people like them directly. So this is one of those amazing things whereby, focusing on your mission, you're actually making money. You don't have to focus on the money first. And so we found that this process is universal, it's replicable. We've worked with more than 250 organizations serving people across 90 countries. It works every time. Every time the newsroom is committed to it and they say we're going to do this, it works. People have questions everywhere. It's not something that's only working in one culture or another country. And just to let you know, we have this engagement management system, which is a technology to help keep it all organized, because you might be wondering, oh my goodness, how do you do this workflow? How do you keep things organized, et cetera? We built one from scratch because we couldn't find anything that did the job for a newsroom. And so it's specifically created for newsroom engagement. So I wanted to talk real quickly before we end here about when this model doesn't work, because there's a reason when it doesn't work. And what we found when we've looked at all the patterns is one basic overarching theme, is that newsrooms are stuck in a different era, when they're stuck in the information age, instead of kind of adapting, the machine age, instead of adapting to the information age, it doesn't work. So if we look at the left, this is the way information used to work up until relatively recently. There were gatekeepers, people who had the information and nobody else did. There was a scarcity of information. There were these designated platforms where you'd go to get it, and there was time and space that were carved out for it. Now, of course, in the information age, everyone can be a news creator. Everyone can break news. There's infinite information. There's no scarcity. In fact, people just need relevance instead of, the amount of news. And it's on every platform. It's not just a TV or a newspaper or whatnot. It's ubiquitous. And so for newsrooms that are stuck in the old way of thinking, then they're still thinking about being optimized for speed, efficiency, and distribution. This doesn't work in the information age. Being fastest doesn't really matter. Being super efficient, of course it matters to some degree, but being everywhere at once is not the way to do things, because people don't need more information. They need better information, more targeted information. And so if your newsroom keeps talking about like feeding the beasts, really focusing first and foremost on how are we going to get this done by the nightly newscast, you're shutting the public out of the process, because to have them involved might be a little less efficient at sometimes. And the public in this approach is treated as a consumer to extract value from instead of to create it. So how does the emerging newsroom model look? Well, it's totally different. Again, it's optimized for listening. So starting with the public, it's optimized for relevance and creating trust. Because also, if you don't have trust, it doesn't matter if you pump out 1,000 stories a day. People aren't going to be watching or listening. So you need to have that relationship layer built in. This, again, the focus is what can we help the public understand or do? And if that's your question, you have to involve them. You can't just assume you know what they want. And so the public then becomes engaged in the story process, and they're treated as a partner to create value for instead of to extract it from. And so you might think about, this is a common question we see in newsrooms, this false dichotomy of, should we give the public what they want or what they need? And to me, again, that's a question that comes from a very paternalistic kind of parental, approach. Should I feed my child candy because that's what he wants? Or do I feed him vegetables because that's what he needs? Not the way to look at it. That's a parental approach. Instead, the question should be, what does the public not know that we can find out for them? And as you can see, the top two questions end up meaning the newsroom decides. You only know after you publish or broadcast if it worked. The types of stories that can result from, just trying to follow the quote unquote wants and your metrics can result in clickbait, which no journalists got into the business to do. It's very demoralizing after a while. And you're just looking at analytics to see if it worked. When you think about what does the public need, it might result in quote unquote important stories that maybe win awards, and that's how you know if it was worthwhile. Again, no shade on these types of stories that result. We need a wide variety. But really, when you focus on what the public doesn't know, you have infinite variety. Before you spend any money on doing a story that people care and they matter. And then as a journalist, you did your job if you just answered their question. And let me tell you, it's nice to sleep at night after putting in a lot of time and effort on reporting a story and feeling like this completely mattered. I knew it mattered. I don't have to wait to see what the analytics scores are tomorrow, or if my boss takes notice. I served someone because they asked me for a specific need. Now, the barriers to adopting this are many. So there's a perception of limited resources. How do we add this to what we're already doing? I would argue you don't add this, you take away some stuff that isn't working, that isn't done in this style, and then you have the ability to do this instead. Sometimes the leadership just doesn't understand the value. They're used to saying, we're the authorities, we're the ones who know best. And so it's hard to convince them. And then of course, the workflow challenges are real of how do we think differently and change our processes. And then the cultural barriers of just people feeling maybe threatened sometimes that they're not in charge or in control anymore. So these are the types of things that we see some newsrooms run into that we help them through. So just looking widely, engagement where I see we are as an industry, in order for it to become that profit center and for it to become an engine of sustainability, we need to go from starting with projects to test out to becoming a practice where it's not even a question if we're going to engage, it's just built into the workflow, and then it can become a profit center. And I think every newsroom is at a different spot on the spectrum, but I see as a whole, the news industry is still kind of at the project level, trying to make it a practice. Some newsrooms have made it a practice. And so I'll end with just 3 quick takeaways. The first is that every shift in practice and process starts small. You don't have to reinvent your entire newsroom overnight. That's impossible. It's too hard on everyone. It will gain momentum if you keep with it. So you can start with projects. It's a perfectly great place to begin. The second takeaway is that not every single story needs to be created in this way to create value and results. In fact, if 10%, 1 out of every 10 of your stories was done in this way, it would be a game changer. And then you don't have to compromise mission for money if you center the public's curiosity. It doesn't have to be oh, well, what's the business going to think, et cetera. Everything trickles down if you start with what the public is asking you for. So I'll end here with a quote from one of our best users of this public-powered approach, Ashley Alvarado, who, if you haven't seen her work before, I'll tweet it out. She's just incredible. And she's found at her newsroom in Los Angeles, California, that these stories lead to more loyal and local audiences and that the money follows. So I really appreciate the time you've given me today. I hope that was comprehensible. Hearken again means to listen. I appreciate you listening, and we're here for you, to hear you. We also have an office in Denmark that serves our European partners. So you have people on the same time zone or similar, and we would love to see if this is an approach that you'd like support with in trying out in your own news organization. So thank you so much. I'll exit out of the slides. Oh, Natalia, I think you're muted. Oh, still muted.
I think I've now been unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Great.
Jennifer, thank you so much. I think we have a minute or so for 5 minutes actually for a question, and we have a question from the audience. And the question is actually similar to what I was going to ask, which is, can you say a bit more about adoption? What are some of the lessons that you've learned and best practices about getting people at various levels of a news organization to get on board? So could you address that, sort of short of signing up for the engagement management system that you guys offer? Are there simple things that newsrooms can do to put themselves on a path to listening?
Definitely. So what we see is that if the change comes from the top down, so if a general manager, a newsroom editor, someone in charge says, hey, we're doing this, and you haven't gotten the buy-in of the news organization yet, it's less likely to work. So we like to try and find at 2 different levels, and you can do this yourself at your newsroom, is if you bring this idea up to some reporters, do some of them light up? Do they get extremely excited? If so, that's who you start with, experimenting with the process. We know that newsrooms have gone through so many changes in the past decade that it's really exhausting for, and hard for reporters and editors to say, oh, another new thing, great. And if you start off with that approach, it's going to be less likely to work. So try and find the people who are going to be the makers, so the journalists, the producers, the editors, who respond to this naturally and think it's a great idea and want to experiment. Start with them. And then you can have someone up top, whether it's their boss or their boss's boss, also say, hey, we're going to experiment with this. And the other big part is give it time. You know, you might do one story and it's your top story of all time, which has happened before. And then the newsroom's like, how do we keep repeating that, et cetera? Or you might do your first story and it does okay. And everyone's like, well, that didn't work, you know, so amazingly well. You know, maybe it's not worth our time. Give it a year. Give it a year, be consistent. So even if it's deciding you're going to answer one question a month, that's fine. You can start there. You can do one question a week, et cetera, but be consistent so the public starts to know that you're open to listening to them.
So it can be as simple as getting a reporter or two in the newsroom to reach out to the audiences on their social accounts and start asking the questions and then acting on them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's really helpful though is making sure you have a destination, because as soon as that post disappears in a feed, people don't know that you're listening anymore. So even if it's just on their bio page or somewhere else, you can, you know, say that, hey, we're always listening, so that people start to build that habit.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I was very struck by the fact that it works every time. Oh, I heard a bark, and we are almost out of time. That you said it works it works every time, and you are working in different cultures and countries. Does it work across different cultures as well?
Definitely. And I apologize for the dog bark in the background. We're all working from home these days. It does. What's been fun to see is that some cultures, you know, the people who ask questions are so eager to be involved and be like the star of the story. And in other cultures, they're like, no, 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 no. I just want to ask the question. I don't want to be involved. So some of our partners in Finland found that the Finns don't want to be featured in the stories, but they love asking questions. And in the US, you know, no surprise, the people who ask questions want to be the star of the story. So, you know, sometimes those kind of cultural differences happen, but there's never been a shortage of demand to answer questions in every culture. And we've worked across Russian, Hindu, Urdu, you know, in Africa, like all over the place, people have questions.
That's great. Jennifer, thank you so much. One other question that we have is whether the presentations will be available for further reference. So I don't know whether you'll be making it public or not.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, I will tweet it out. I'll put in the chat real quick a link to it, a public link, so that you can find it. And I'll also share it on Twitter. So yes.
That's great. Thank you so much.